So, it gives me also a great pleasure to come to the Gangtok. This is my first visit, and Tashi Detsaba and I first met many years ago when we were MA students at the University of Washington in Seattle, working on various Tibet topics in the footsteps of Gene Smith. So this is, for me, an auspicious moment. So the title of my paper is Sikkim and Bhutan and the Crosscurrents of 17th and 18th century Tibetan history. In 1757, the British East India Company gained effective control over rural India. And within 20 years, the first Governor General Hastings had sent the famous diplomatic missions of George Bogle and Samuel Turner north into the Himalayas, the driving force being the hope of English merchants to open a trade route through the back door of Tibet to what was then perceived as a potentially limitless market of China. The British merchants are still chasing the limitless markets of China, but that's not the topic of this talk. Not until 233 years later, in 1996, did Hastings' dream for the advancement of British commerce finally begin to come true, when India and China signed an agreement for the reopening of Natula Pass for trade. But here we are, more than 12 years after that agreement was signed, and very little trade is in fact passing through Natula. So some have asked, what happened? Why has this happened? And to me, it seems a pattern of the history of the Himalayas, in part as viewed from Tibetan sources, that goes back hundreds of years. This is, I seem to have lost the audio. No? And so my paper really kind of deals with this issue and comes up to the 17th and 18th century by looking backwards in time. And reviewing the events of the past 400 years, one could conclude that the role played by the inhabited Himalayan lands has not only been that of a buffer zone, but that the perception of the zone, this is the important thing, has oscillated between what I would call a mythic symbolic and a realist strategic approach, between a zone of symbolism and one of practical state strategy. And gradually, of course, over many centuries, a vocabulary of mythic and quasi-historical elements arose uniquely associated with the Himalayan zone, although the mythic symbolic aspect gradually has given way to the realistic and strategic elements. Sikkim and Bhutan, given what might on one level look like very common or very similar origins. And so that's really the topic that I'm addressing. And as part of that, I'm looking at documents that discuss the conflicts that went on between the three states over different issues. So I'm going to move back in time now. We're not looking at 17th century. We're looking at 1,000 years earlier. And during that era, let's say the 7th and the 8th century, Sikkim and Bhutan occupied part of what I call a common mythical space in the Tibetan worldview. It was a vague, primordial southern frontier on the border with India. And the term Mern, or Mon, is used in a few early texts. The oldest one I'm aware of, and maybe others, was the treaty pillar inscription of 821, 822 between Tibet and China that mentions the frontier of the south and uses the term Mon or Mern India in a very ambiguous way. And this issue of ambiguity is very important because it continues all through history. Of course, there were many districts along the southern Himalayan fringe that once contained communities known as Mern or Mon, all the way from Ladakh in the west to Nepal to Sikkim, Chumbi Valley, Bhutan, and then further moving to the east, and Manu as part of Tibet itself. In Tibetan perceptions, the Mern people, known as Murmba, were seen as a lesser race generally, who did not belong to one of the 6 primordial tribes of Tibetan peoples. Hoba, Southerners, in general, were described as beast-like speakers of garbled dialects, unenlightened by the teachings of Buddhism. This was the perception. Coupled with this, the southern frontier zone was described by most early Tibetan visitors as a hot wilderness harboring dangerous animals, jungles, and disease. And I'm putting together material from a couple of different centuries in order to paint a general picture of what traditional southern Himalayan areas were perceived in Tibetan texts to be like. The first important historical event affecting the Mern Southlands was the construction of 12 border temples, the famous ones by the 7th century Tibetan Emperor Songtsen Gampo. Everyone is familiar with the story of the rock demoness and the monkey, and how the temple's purpose was to stake out, in the mythology at least, the boundaries of the Tibetan Empire. Later Tibetan writers, of course, placed a more Buddhist interpretation on these temples, and the list grew to 108 as subsequent emperors constructed new ones in acts of piety and Buddhist piety and atonement. At least 2 of the original 12 and others besides are now located outside Tibet, and in fact in Bhutan in particular, where a purely religious interpretation of them is maintained. Yet even after Bhutan became an independent state, and during periods of war between Bhutan and Tibet, which were not uncommon in history, several Tibetan rulers sent funds to sponsor rites at these temples for the welfare of the Tibetan state and as a means of state diplomacy to find common ground between the warring parties. And so the focus on temples as part of this symbolic, mythic element also merged into, let's call it the tactical realist views. They shaded into one another, even at that early date. Moving forward in time then, the 8th century saw the advent of 2 new but interrelated phenomena affecting the southern frontier in the Tibetan worldview. The first was the coming of a tantric master, Padmasambhava, to Tibet, who gave rise to not only a remarkable religious movement, but also to a particular literary phenomenon, the so-called terma or hidden text phenomenon. And the traditions tell us that both the Hernbo and the Buddhist followers of Padmasambhava engaged in the systematic concealment of religious texts in hidden lands, or bayu, which mostly are to be found along the southern frontier in districts that were also known as districts of Mernba inhabitants. And you find this kind of an overlay between temples for the staking out of the Tibetan frontier with Mernba inhabitants and the hiding of religious texts by both Hernbo and Buddhists. And the purpose, of course, for the hiding of texts was the preservation of this sacred literature in the face of persecution by non-believer armies who were foreshadowed as coming either as Mongols or Turks or basically non-believers in the 12th century. The thesis was amplified in rediscovered treasure histories and biographies of Padmasambhava, also beginning in the late 12th and early centuries. And these histories contain detailed lists of hidden lands, caves, and temples where treasure texts were to be discovered by designated treasure finders. A movement began, most people are familiar with, of inspired treasure finders, believing it to be their foretold destiny, traveling, and they traveled into, and the term was used of opening up hidden lands in the once feared southern Himalayan zone. And by the 15th century, this movement accomplished most of what I would call the exploration of the Mern frontier, and they left behind descriptions and guidebooks for others to follow. So whereas the southern Mern frontier was at one time a foreign zone to Tibet, because of this idea of the history of the Bail and the hidden text, it became an attraction in later centuries and brought explorers, almost like Kipling's poem Explorer, go, you're lost and found behind the ranges, waiting for you, go and find it. It was, I believe it was that sort of a spirit in a sense, but in a Tibetan context that brought all of these people, not only to Bhutan, but to Sikkim, to Nepal, and to really all along the Himalayan chain. And this resulted in the exploration of that zone from the Tibetan perspective. From the Hernbo perspective, to me at least, it was a remarkable fact that the discovery of more hidden religious texts from the so-called Katen canonical collection are attributed to a single cave in the Paro Valley than any other location. And so, Bhutan is very, very important in this tradition. For example, 6 entire chapters out of the Katang Denga treasure text discovered attributed to Organ Lingpa in the 14th century are devoted to hidden treasure sites in Bhutan. 6 chapters. So the theme of refuge in hidden lands came to play an important role in later Tibetan history. The 14th century Drukpa monk Churti Barawa wrote numerous songs lamenting the troubled times in Tibet during his life, Mongol marauders, robbers, and so forth. And the poem said it's time to flee to the southern land, the hidden lands in the south, for monks, holy men like us. And so he came to Bhutan and he founded temples here, small monasteries, one of which at least still exists. And to my knowledge, the oldest printed text in Bhutan actually was printed at Drangibunga in Paro Valley in 1500. Also, periods of major regime change in Tibet were almost always accompanied by discoveries of prophecies from Padmasambhava, foreshadowing times of trouble, times when monks should take refuge in the south. And in fact, much of the history of Sikkim and Bhutan hinges on the lives of personalities such as this, who believed themselves foreshadowed to go to the south, or who actually, in a historical sense, said, I'm going to the south. Sikkim and Bhutan. Longchenpa, for example, the great Nyingma philosopher, took refuge in central Bhutan in the mid-14th century to escape persecution from the founder of the Pamal dynasty. And while he was there, he composed a famous ode to the divine hidden land of Bhutan that included these verses. In these days, through the maliciousness of men, the Buddha's teachings are near to decline in central Tibet. Demon armies from the borders have raised strife in the center. The time is so that enlightenment is best cultivated in places such as this. But the jeweled doors to the hidden lands of the frontier will not long remain closed. Soon they will be opened. The border armies of the Mongols are newly arrived. This causes me great sorrow. Before this happens, men of faith, desirous of liberation, should renounce fond attachment to their native lands to devote their lives to cultivating wisdom. The time has come to travel to the hidden lands of the frontier. This was in the mid-1400s. 100 years later, at the time of the overthrow of the Pamal dynasty by the Rinpoche princes, another set of prophecies turned up and inspired more treasure finders and refugees to the southlands. And the last example of this type that I'll give you is the Tibetan saint and bridge builder Tongdong Gyalpo himself, who also came to Bhutan at the end of the Pamal dynasty, probably driven in part by the same events in Tibet, but also he claimed to have been inspired by the goddess Tara to spread the light of the Buddha's teachings in the dark and sinful lands of Bhutan, Laya, Paro, Eastern Mern, to Kamata, that is to say Kuch Bihar in India, and among the Lobas of Arunachal Pradesh. And everybody knows that his bridge building activity, not only in Bhutan but in Tibet. And the iron for those bridges, I believe, almost all came from Bhutan. We have descriptions of the iron fetching exercise. So moving on quickly, I want to mention that the second 8th century theme that impacted southern Himalayan zone was that of the expulsion or exile of royal figures. This is a very important one as well, and there are many stories existing of exiled Tibetan prince, such as Zangma from the 9th century, who came to the south, theoretically, or by tradition at least, founding small principalities and new family lines. And these episodes, as I mentioned earlier, also overlap the accounts of treasure text concealment and discovery. So there's this kind of a nexus of mythology that incorporates all of these elements in it, all part of this traditional mythic mode of interpretation of the Himalayan zone, in my view. Then comes the 16th century, at the end of which, to summarize, just before the state building activity began, the southern Himalayan zone had been broadly settled. The communal pattern seems, as far as we can determine, a very similar one of small autonomous village clusters and petty kingdoms, often separated by major geographical barriers. Due to the centuries of activity by monks in the so-called opening and taming of these areas in a Buddhist sense, various schools of Tibetan Buddhism tended to predominate in different areas along the Himalayan zone, but in some cases a tie to a Tibetan monastery or school was loose, but in others it was quite tight, and in some cases taxes or religious tithes were being collected and returned to the home monastery in Tibet. In Sikkim and central Bhutan, the Nyingma, the predominant school. In western Bhutan, most of the villages were allied with Drupa Kajapa monks associated with Ralu Monastery. Eastern Bhutan and Tibetan Mernyu were the home of Galupa monasteries, as well as some Nyingmapa and, of course, Purgo throughout. While the Chumbi Valley saw a mixture of Drupa, Nyingmapa, and Papa monastic groups that were, the Haba had by that time become a part of the Galupa sect. And in conclusion, while this picture is somewhat oversimplified, it does give a relatively representative view, I think, of how these societies in the Himalayan zone functioned. They were relatively fixed relative to each other. Not necessarily harmoniously connected, but not a lot of change there. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll back up 20 minutes. Okay. So the key point about the small communities in the Himalayan zone during that era, in my view, just at the end of the 16th century, was that while they were not necessarily friendly with each other, naturally, this was the way of society, none of them could command extensive resources to threaten the other if they had an inclination to do so. It was perhaps a tense relationship, but they had very limited power. All of that changed in the first half of the 17th century with the formation of new state entities in Sikkim and Bhutan and the overthrow of the previous central authority in Tibet, the kings of Dzong, and the installation of the fifth Dalai Lama by his Mongol patrons. The new dynamic that these changes introduced was that of a dominant sectarian power harnessed to the will of state authorities that could now play out over a wider landscape, including the power to collect taxes, and in Tibet and Bhutan to levy armies or local militias. In Sikkim, the central authority of the Chogyal Kunzu Namgyal was less unitary in that that authority was constrained by alliance not only with the leading families within Sikkim, as was discussed yesterday in Saul's paper, representing the local ethnic communities, but in the case of the Drupa of Western Bhutan, did not have that. So my view is that the formation I'll just get to the nut of it, the state formation with much more power and the ability to collect taxes and levy militia armies was where they looked at issues from a much more strategic basis than had been the case previously, was the changing factor that pushed these small areas in completely different directions from each other, based on issues that were unique to those particular locations, but were ultimately driven by sectarian forces between, let's say, Tibet and Bhutan and Sikkim. The relationships between the three new state militias illustrate the fluidity of two distinct modes, one being the traditional form invoking notions of Lama-patron relationships, and the other being the more modern confrontational dynamic involving all of the familiar tools of interstate conflict, such as espionage, armed aggression, territorial conquest, and so on. And we find all of that in the history record. How am I doing for time?
15 minutes.
Okay. So, in the case of Tibet and Sikkim, the relationship between Tibet and Sikkim following state formation was of the former kind, that is to say, the traditional form. This is how it's presented in the literature. The Dalai Lama and the Sikkim Chogyal were linked by Kama Nyingmapa spiritual intermediaries, teachers and disciples, in particular Hadzun Chembu Namka Jikmi and others who participated allegedly, although Saul may have further insights on that, in the Chogyal's enthronement ceremony. This relationship continued with the subsequent Dalai Lamas and Chogyals, resulting in Sikkim becoming formally linked to the Manchu Empire via Tibet. The Royal Chronicle of Sikkim that's been discussed shows vividly all through the 19th century how the Sikkim state was caught between the traditional ties to Tibet based on the traditional form of relationship and the state's strategic pressures that came not only from Tibet, from China, but also from British India. And so not only were there conflicting powers, but they were conflicting on almost completely different levels. And the Sikkim folks had to struggle with this, and they really suffered. I could see this. I mean, it was in the literature, you can really see how Sikkim had a tough time with this struggle. In the case of Tibet and Bhutan, it was quite different. The case of Bhutan was in fact almost completely, I would say, different from that of Sikkim. Once the Sheptrung set up government in Bhutan in roughly 1625, there was very little room for the continuance of any kind of traditional mythic symbolic relationship between Tibet and Bhutan. Whereas traditionally the spread of influence from a governing center / monastic shung in Tibet, going back in history, was through the medium, let's say, of a network of branch monasteries to outlying areas. In the new state strategic mode, the spread of influence was through outright control of land, forcibly if necessary. And so in Bhutan, which became a Drupa state from the outset, right from the beginning, the control of land and resources became an uppermost concern. Hence the construction of fortress zones whose architecture and scale vastly exceeded anything previously existing in Bhutan. The monastery storerooms in these zones, for example, whereas previously the small monasteries of Bhutan might have had a storeroom to support a few monks, the zones now were designed to store supplies and weapons for large numbers of zone officials and functionaries in case of a war with Tibet or outside forces, but primarily with Tibet. The intensity of the mutual hatred, I would say, between Bhutan and Tibet, based on sectarian differences during that era, and its impact on the events of Tibetan history, in my view, have not been sufficiently taken account of by Tibetan historians of that time. But it's not the topic I want to go into here. So now if we look at Sikkim, I view this as a case where Sikkim was in effect caught between the forces of Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal. But I'm going to focus only on the Tibet-Bhutan-Sikkim relationship. I've looked at, in a couple of other articles, how the Tibet-Bhutan conflict unfolded after 1616, when the Sheptrung came as a refugee from Ralung Monastery in Tibet, until that enmity began to be unwound in the mid-1740s, over 130 years later. So here I want to simply look at a few of the dynamics in that 130 years and how they relate to the Sikkim state. And even here I can't go into enormous detail because there is quite a bit. We have the advantage in that we have the Tibetan perspective as painted in, let's say, the biographies of the 5th Dalai Lama, the 6th Dalai Lama, writings of the Desi, Sangye Gyatso. And then we have the perspective from several Sikkimese sources looking at it. The Danjong Gelrup is one. And then the Bhutanese, we have a number of very important, small but very important sources that discuss relations with Sikkim from their perspective. And so we have three contrasting points of view, which is unusual to find in Tibetan historiography. In the period before the creation of the Sikkim and Bhutan states, the districts between the two countries, including Chumbi, were inhabited by small villages not allied or unallied to larger states. We have the account of a few monks, in particular those of the Parakajrupa sect, who had set up monasteries in the area, whose biographies provide glimpses into local society. There were the usual small chieftains competing for land, etc., in the descriptions. But with the rise of the new sent chief negotiators to help settle these disputes. In one of the mediations, the same minister, Drunir Gyaltane, who had earlier negotiated a peace treaty in Ladakh, about whom Peter Schwieger has written a book. He was later sent to Chumbi to try to settle one of these fights between Sikkim and Bhutan. So while these discussions were in progress, meanwhile, the struggle was still going on in a more traditional fashion. The then ruler of Bhutan was sponsoring a course of destructive sorcery in the zone in 1685, aimed at the Tibetan mediator, Gyaltane, who was apparently not negotiating in a way that the Bhutanese favored. And as a result, protective deities, as we were told, came to his assistance. And Drunir Gyaltane died of smallpox at Gyantse early in the following year. The news was received in Bhutan with a large festival of Thanksgiving, during which the Gurkang at Wangdi Pojang was renamed Damnak Gurkang in commemoration of the death of the Tibetan mediator. So this gives you some flavor of the fierce ferociousness of these fights. Quickly going on to the 1690s, a treaty had been signed in 1687 between the forces in Chumbi, but it didn't hold. 5 minutes. I'll move on really quickly. Events unfolded in the 1690s are not entirely different from those of the 1650s and the 1680s. The only difference being that the Tibetan players now included Polane's father, the famous Kema Gyalpo, and this is where Polane began to rise in the esteem of the Manchus because of the role that he and his family later played not only in Chumbi, but Polane himself actually led an expedition into central Bhutan, into Bhutan, where he participated in the sack and burning of villages and forcing peace talks to take place there. And this, again, in the 1714 period, during the era of Hasan Khan in Tibet, he became involved in these disputes. And a perspective is given in one Bhutanese source about why these fights were going on. This is a small monk, but an important voice. He says, the local chieftains of Bhutan and Tibet gave way to their mountainous egos. Low-class and evil men raised ceaseless havoc with the weapons of misery, so that everyone, high and low alike, was driven helplessly from his home. The last point I want to talk about is that as a result of this activity, the aggression from Bhutan into Sikkim, the Bhutanese were able to gain control of certain estates in Sikkim, and even, it would appear, estates in Gangtok, the capital. We have one document from, this is a coronation document from Bhutan in 1747, at which all of the taxpayers of Bhutan received a gift. And so, in effect, it amounts to a census document for the whole country. And the interesting thing relative to Sikkim is that taxes were being collected from 143 families in the Gangtok area, and gifts were given to chieftains who apparently were subservient to Bhutan at that time. Here in Gangtok, we know of a Dzongpur named Argyal, and 3 Gangtok Shelmo chiefs named Gelder and Rupden. There were 4 others whose names are not given, and then various tax families. And they got shawls and fancy gifts, and then the ordinary folks, their families each got a fraction of a coin called a maka. And so it shows you, eventually this influence over Sikkim did go away. But this was another aspect of how this began to play out. So just really in conclusion, what I'm saying is that from the very earliest times, when the relations between the states, the view of the Tibetans was that of the southern area is a dangerous zone of Murmbas, non-Tibetans or quasi-Tibetans. It gradually grew in importance through the medium of these explorations by Tergurns looking for hidden texts, the discovery of those texts, the elevation of places of ancient history in Sikkim and Bhutan to much greater relevance due to, in the context of later political events, and almost like a politicization of the importance of these temples, the Kichu Lakang and Gurje Lakang in Bhutan, Jumbe Lakang at that time, and small others that don't quite make the major list. Because of the perpetuation, when times were needed, of a retreat, let's say, to the mythic symbolic as a means of conducting state strategy in later years. I hope that's clear. Sorry. That's my speech. Do we have time for questions? Questions?
So, Dr. Francois, and then to you, Peter.
Yes. In fact, it's not a question, it's just that through the marriage, and she has a list of marriage. So that also is a big difference between Sikkim and Bhutan, is the marriage link, the alliance.
Thank you. I haven't seen the article, but that
excellent.
it fits exactly
In the Bulletin of Tibetology.
Which one was that? That was like about, we have a bit of information in the by the monks of the Barawa Kajapa sect. In fact, it was Churji Barawa when he became heavily involved in negotiating, helping solve some of these disputes. And so via those passages, we can see something about how these took place. He was a brother fighting nephew. It was this typical kind of land grabbing over small issues. But for other parts of Bhutan, we don't have any substantial information, unfortunately.
The Barakaji school went to Bhutan. The founder, Barawa Jinse, he himself went to Bhutan.
Yes.
And Dongye Monastery and the rest. But when it comes to Sikkim, it didn't came from Bhutan. In fact, it was a Kirong, a Barawa master, Ducho Goncho Jensen, who was born in Kirong. He came from Shangbara Densa to Sikkim around 1657. And the most interesting thing is, around 17th century, when the center of Shangbara, when they discuss about monasteries in Bhutan, or in Chungu Valley, or in Sikkim, they always talk about Le Lobu or Le Gwene. They do not make distinctions between Tonu Kaishi Lobu or Denjong Lobu or Domo Lobu. They don't. They just, there's a general kind of a term for that.
Southern
disciples and southern monasteries.
The biography, he specifically says how he was driven out of Bhutan by the Shuptrum's forces, and he had to leave Bhutan, and he went to Nepal and Chumbi. Yeah. That's in his Bible.
Yeah, and then interestingly, he was very, very active in Damsa and in Chuntang.
Yes.
So
he had a monastery in Damsa.
Yes, and then the Barakaji in Dromo starts after him, not before.
I condensed a lot of material there. If I mixed a couple up in terms of time, I apologize.
Thank you. We just have time for a quick question, Doctor.
The answer to teacher's query you have given, the political countries have done it. The state formation and nation building. The state building is entirely a different issue. So if you say that what happened in Bhutan and Sikkim, the states were formed for a period of time. And nation built, once the nation is established, then you build institutions. Let us do like this. So part of the answer comes from that. Thank you.
Because we are quite a distance. If I have heard you correctly, you said that in 1743 or 1747, Gangtok was paying tax to Bhutan.
I said that certain, there were taxpayers in Gangtok.
So if you could kindly throw some more light on that, when it was started, how, what kind of taxes were paid, and how long they continue to be paid.
Okay.
And also, sir, I have one suggestion. Whenever any person stands up and asks questions, he should introduce himself. I am Sona Wangdi from Sikkim, sir. Thank you.
So we have this one document. It was preserved in the biography of a very famous ruler of Bhutan in the 18th century. And if it hadn't been in his biography, we probably would not have this document preserved. And all it shows, and this is one small segment for the entire document, which is in this 1 year, and then below that there are several small zones, one of which was Daling, or Dalinka, which is closer to Sikkim, and then below them were these few leaders or rulers in Gangtok. And after that, we don't know, and before that, we don't know. So we don't know how they, when they exactly were there, but it must have been an outgrowth of this gradual encroachment, into Sikkim in earlier decades. And perhaps even, by the stationing of, what you might call, let's call it a political officer or something like this. I mean, an agent of the Bhutan government residing in Gangtok may have had, right to levy taxes on some local, villages. We just simply don't know enough information. Sorry, I can't help. Maybe if there's anyone here from Sikkim, if they recognize these names, from any historical work we've done, I'd very much appreciate any insights that you can provide.
Okay, thank you. That brings this.